Trigger warning, depression is discussed in this podcast episode 196. Some people may find this triggering. If this causes you any distress, please call Lifeline Australia on 13 11 14 or contact your nearest hospital, emergency services, doctor or medical professional. Welcome to Feel Good From Within. I'm Yvette Blowitz, your host, and I'm so excited that you're here with me today listening in. And thank you for being part of our show and our incredible global community. I'm so grateful. Today's guest is Dr. Michael Henry, who is a psychiatrist, director of ECT at Massachusetts General Hospital, director of bipolar clinic and research program at Massachusetts General Hospital. He is a professor at Harvard Medical School. He is also the author of Brain Reboot, New Treatments for Healing Depression. Dr. Michael Henry's life mission is to help anyone suffering with treatment-resistant depression. And in Brain Reboot, he provides an overview of the new cutting edge of treatments. He also shares tips for supplementing your recovery with exercise, nutrition, and sleep. I hope you learned so much, and this podcast show allows you to grow. Hi everyone, it's Yvette Blowitz from SPAITGIRL.com, and welcome to Feel Good From Within. I'm super excited to be here with you today and with our very special guest, Michael Henry, who is a psychiatrist and director of bipolar clinic and research program at MGH, Massachusetts General Hospital. And he's also the associate professor at Harvard. And we're here today to talk to Michael Henry about his brand new book, Brain Reboot, New Treatments for Healing Depression. How ketamine, TMS, and ECT can give relief and hope. Michael Henry, how are you today?
I'm great, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. As I mentioned, we had a wonderful time visiting Australia several years ago, so I'm delighted to be speaking to an Australian audience.
And I'm so delighted I stumbled across your book in Audible. I was really fascinated with the new treatments for healing depression. Before we dive into your book, would you be happy to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
I really got my start in medical school, and part of our training is to do sort of rotations in different specialties. And when I got to psychiatry, I just found it fascinating. It's a nice mix of medicine where you could talk about the physical problems the person was having. You had to figure out what the limited number of medications that were available at the time would do in terms of interacting. And then you had to think about the brain. And then most importantly, you had to think about the person. Because besides all that biology, there's a person there, right? And that's really what attracted me was how do you help this human being who's suffering get better? So that's how I got into psychiatry. I really found the work entrancing and enjoyed it. I then, after medical school, did a residency in psychiatry. I did a fellowship at the National Institutes of Health, and then went on to McLean Hospital, where I was the director of ECT for about 10 years. And then into St. Elizabeth's in Boston, where I was the chairman of psychiatry, continued to do ECT. And then lastly, I've been at the Mass General, where I'm actually the medical director of the bipolar clinic, but I am the director of the ECT service at MGH. And we also then have a very robust RTMS service under the direction of Dr. Jawan Camperdon, and we have a very robust ketamine service under the direction of Dr. Christina Kuzin. And we sort of share ideas, share patients, and sort of have kind of nice group think about how to help people feel better. And in terms of the book itself, it was really motivated by a request from one of the patients said, I really want to help the person I know get over their fear of ECT, and you should write a book about ECT. And I just said, there's been many books written about ECT. The shift is about ECT, TMS, and ketamine. And the underlying shift really is about brain circuitry and the idea of you're interacting with and affecting brain circuitry. So that's kind of how I got to this point in terms of things, how the book came to be written. Again, as always, these are things that one has to acknowledge a lot of other people. I hope you paid attention to the acknowledgement section in the book as well, because I had a lot of great people supporting me.
How many years have you been working in the mental health field?
These gray hairs should probably give it away. I will tell you that it's 34 years.
Wow, 34 years.
I've been very fortunate that early on in that career, I met people who were interested in this kind of treatment and helping the people for whom nothing else was working. And I think that's really propelled me forward to thinking about this. Then people like Bill Potter at the NIH, who gave me the tools to think about how to image the brain and how to actually study it. Those are all things that have built my experiences and have gone into this book.
Would you be able to explain to us what is depression?
I will do my best to tell you what the current thinking is about it. And it's built on the work of many great people. Helen Mayberg, for example, was definitely a pioneer in the work in this area. Wayne Drevitz also pioneers, but they were the ones who brought us from the idea of it was conflicts, unresolved issues, to actually parts of the brain aren't working the way they should. Well, that's what leads you to feel bad about things. But, a lot of times people think of being depressed as being bummed out, if you'll forgive me an American term. And the difference between the two is significant because people will feel sad about things, but if something good happens, they can enjoy it. But they'll say, I'm depressed. And I forget being picked up by one of my cousin's wife who said, why don't you just tell them to motivate themselves and lift themselves out of it? And that's really the problem, right? We think of this bummed out, just motivate, push through. But the reality is that people can't. They don't cause it. They don't want to be that way. It's not something they did. It's not because they're too lazy to lift themselves out of it. It's because the part of the brain that motivates you, organizes you, and gets you to sort of initiate action is dysfunctional. It's underactive. It's this part called the frontal cortex, and it doesn't work for you. So it's not that you're not trying to do stuff. It's not that you don't want to do stuff. It's quite simply, you really can't initiate and sustain the energy to get stuff done. And that, combined with feeling sad, being unable to enjoy things, having problems with your sleep, having problems with your appetite, either eating too much or too little, that is really the syndrome of depression. And that pervades every aspect of the person's life. It doesn't just sort of happen when something bad happens or not feeling good because, something went wrong. It happens even when good things happen. The world has gone from vibrant colors to gray. You can't see the colors. You can't really feel joy. Now, what confuses people also is because there's a concept known as diurnal variation, okay? In other words, people's moods change throughout the day. So some people will wake up feeling really terrible and then start to feel better as the day goes on. And then there's the reverse. People will feel better and then start to feel really bad as the day goes on. Both of those are entirely consistent with this biological circuitry model. It reflects the fact that our brain changes throughout the day and how we're interacting with light and the environment changes throughout the day. That's really the syndrome of depression. You have a pervasive mood, you have an inability to motivate, you have disruption in your sleep, your appetite, things like that. And that is based on dysfunction of brain circuitry. Now, in terms of going on that, I don't think the science is there yet. And it's probably worth mentioning that a lot of what's held us up, COVID has been great for making it okay for people to say, hey, I'm depressed. It's been more acceptable because a lot of people can relate, whereas before people were too busy to relate. But the other thing that's really sort of held us up over the years has been the fact that the brain is encased in a bony skull, and so it's protected. And also, while we can get in there and remove things if we have to, it's not very ethical to do what's called a brain biopsy. We actually take out somebody's piece of somebody's brain to study it for just science sake. And so the lack of access to the brain to understand its processes has really held up our understanding of it. So it's been with the development of other technologies, things like MRI scanners, which use magnetic fields to allow us to see the brain, things like PET scanners that use radioactive nucleotides to allow us to see the brain in trace amounts, doses that don't hurt people. And it's been, we call the CAT scanners that allow people to also allow us to see what's going on in the brain. Those kinds of developments have allowed us to understand that this is a disease of brain circuitry, and it's not just a lack of motivation or a character flaw for people.
Thank you for explaining that. And when I think about your book, the real reason I was drawn to it was titled Brain Reboot. And I've always believed if we looked at an example, they call it mental illness or mental health, but if we reclassified it to brain disease or brain illness, it would definitely take that myth out that someone who's depressed could just get on with it, get over it, shake it off. It's a bad mood. You're unmotivated. You need
Right.
better willpower. And I think that's why I loved your book so much and why I was truly drawn to it. Plus, the aspect of hope. The book is really about new treatments for healing depression. Can you share what those new treatments are?
Some people argue that ECT is one of the granddaddies of psychiatric treatments because it started actually in about 1938. But what's really changed has been the application of this idea of brain circuitry. So the treatment that we used to give versus the treatment we give now is completely different. We give much gentler stimuli, we give them over longer periods of time, and we target our treatments to certain parts of the brain specifically to try to get that part moving and working again. Ketamine was a total game changer. In the early 2000s, the pharmaceutical industry had gotten so frustrated with trying to come up with new antidepressants that just kept failing one after another. GlaxoSmithKline actually declared they were not going to develop any more antidepressants. They shut down their effort. But then along comes ketamine, which says, hey, wait a minute. We've been thinking about depression as a deficiency of serotonin. We've been thinking about it as a deficiency of norepinephrine, dopamine. Maybe tweak those systems. It takes a couple of weeks, if not months, for them to start to feel better. Maybe we're just affecting something that's indirect, and maybe we can go more directly. And they were working then on a drug called ketamine and the system of the glutamate system in the brain. Now, initially, ketamine was developed as an anesthetic, and it was being used as a probe to sort of study psychosis, but people realized that it was an effective probe of the glutamate system. They gave it, and they had a very dramatic response in patients who previously really hadn't responded to anything. Based on the available data, you would predict only a 15% response rate. So this idea of going directly at the glutamate system, the major excitatory chemical in the brain, the one which the brain uses to make things happen, going directly at that system with a drug to treat depression was a game changer. And it's really brought back a lot of interest in how do we develop that. And in fact, there's a new drug out that just got approved by the FDA. It's a combination of cough medicine, dextromethorphan, and an old antidepressant, bupropion, or Wellbutrin in the US. It's really the new cough medicine that works in a similar way to ketamine. It works at the glutamate system. It works in a bunch of different ways. Ironically, the older antidepressant is merely there to prevent the liver from breaking it down and inactivating it too soon, because the cough suppressant is just metabolized too quickly and inactivated too quickly by the liver. But having the old antidepressant there blocks that. There is a whole host of new development of drugs and excitement in that because of that initial work on these glutamate drugs. And then there's TMS. TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. And the idea here is that you can think of the brain as an electromagnetic coil. It uses electricity for different parts of the brain to talk to each other, transmits small electrical impulses, then causing release of neurotransmitters that then cause further electrical impulses till they get the action they want. Dr. Barker in the UK, his major insight was that you could think of the brain as a coil, and found out that if you use electromagnetic coil external to the head, you can actually change the activity of the underlying brain tissue. And then over the years, people have figured out how to stack that up and build it so that you can actually have a significant change in the function and affect the circuitry that's not working in depression. So you actually park a magnetic coil right here and you stimulate this area directly to sort of alter its function and change the circuitry that it's part of and connected to. And that actually works to treat depression. And when you do that, response rates are in the 50 to 60% rate in a group of people who don't really respond to other things. So that's really been the issue. You've had these three treatments that have really been morphed as a result of our understanding of brain circuitry and our understanding of the primary chemistry that the brain uses to affect things and to go directly at it. And ketamine also has sort of made it okay for us to look again at psychedelics. For all of their baggage, and again, they have caused a number of problems in some people, so they have to be used very carefully, but they work at the glutamate system, and they also can have some interesting antidepressant effects. They're not approved by any regulatory body at this point for that, but they are an interesting set of experiments going on. So that's how we got there, and that's why these are new treatments. It's because they're using the appreciation of the circuitry and the chemistry.
Wow. So the circuitry, the chemistry, and the glutamate system. And this is so different to the messaging I ever heard as a kid growing up in Australia, where it's a mental thing. When we think mental, we think of being like a sports person. Get your mind right. Once you get your mind right, you get everything right. It's all about how you think. And you've just blown that myth out of the ballpark. It must be very exciting after 34 years where you've worked with patients who have tried multiple antidepressant medication and not responded.
It's fantastic. I mean, I'm more excited about what I do now than at any point in my career because the world is opening. There's so much possibilities in terms of us finally cracking the code on some of these really terrible illnesses. If you think about depression, it affects 300 million people worldwide. It's the second leading cause of people living with disability across the world. The economic cost is in the billions. People's careers suffer. In Denmark, they looked at this and they found that people with what's called unipolar depression, or just depression, and as opposed to bipolar depression, when people have manic episodes, they found that they had a substantially lower standard of living, substantially lower economic status and accomplishment. Think about what a tragedy that is, that we just haven't been able to figure out how to help these people get past that and live the lives they want to live. And that's really what this book is about. It's about getting help when you've been told there's nothing else we can do, because now there are things we can do. And that's been the kind of thing where I've seen throughout my career with ECT. It's been a game changer. I see it now with ketamine, where some people say, oh, I finally feel like a human being. I finally feel like I remember feeling before I had this terrible illness. Likewise with TMS, it's like, oh yeah, okay, the meds sort of made me better. Use a sports metaphor. This got me across the goal line. And I now feel like a human being again. And the colors come back in my world. That's incredibly gratifying. I think our options for achieving that are only increasing. I'm very excited about the treatments we have and where we're going with them.
And I loved in your introduction, it said, don't give up hope. Many people find themselves feeling engulfed by despair and hopelessness, which is basically the definition of depression. So whatever brought you to this book, whether it is you or someone close to you who is suffering from depression, know that here you will find its opposite, hope. And I think that's what I love so much about your book, how it was giving relief and hope, but also giving us insight into the new treatments for healing depression, and especially for those who have maybe tried multiple prescriptions from their GP or psychiatrist and not had any relief. All of the work that you and many other people are doing to help really get to the bottom of how can we treat this more effectively is incredible. So I want to personally thank you and everyone else who is working on this very important gift to the world to end human suffering and pain and to get them back, like you said, seeing colors, feeling good, having great relationships with their family, friends, working, and being able to get up and get out of bed again.
It's such a tremendous privilege to have people ask you to help them when they're feeling that badly. For them to actually put their trust in you and to say, what should I do? That is just such an amazing privilege. I can't explain really how much that motivates me, is that this person's relying on me. It motivates the rest of my colleagues as well. I will tell you that the psychiatric scientific community is an amazing group of highly motivated people who genuinely really want people to feel better and get rid of these horrible diseases that are having profound impact on people's lives. I would say thank you to all the people who put their trust in us.
Thank you to your publisher also for bringing this book to the world so we can learn more about depression and what it actually is and ways to treat it. Can I ask you, Michael, for someone who might be listening in right now, they might feel embarrassed about having depression because we still have a stigma lingering from, you mentioned ECT. I remember growing up as a little kid and seeing a scene on a movie which scared the living daylights out of me when it came to ECT, or they called it shock therapy back then. And we had stigmas. I grew up in a small country town. I heard the word manic depression growing up as a kid. but it was this very taboo, don't talk about it. Oh, it was off topic. The kids today are learning more and more about depression, anxiety, and mental illness and all kinds of things. But for anyone who grew up in that era, who might be still too embarrassed to even go and see a doctor to seek help, but what advice would you give to them if they were living in embarrassment and shame?
Well, a couple of things. One is to realize that these are, in many ways, have a genetic component to them. So you, to some degree, inherited a vulnerability. It's not something you necessarily did. Bipolar illness, actually, or manic depression is one of the most strongly inherited psychiatric conditions. But the other thing is to realize that as well as everybody sort of puts themselves together, they make themselves look good, everybody's got issues and everybody struggles from time to time. And talking to your doctor should be something that's very private and allows you to feel safe. And then from there, identify community supports and realize there's a lot of other people around you. I don't know how the Australians feel about Winston Churchill, but he's one of the people who struggled with it. Abraham Lincoln struggled with severe depression, one of our great presidents. And the list of celebrities that have struggled with this is just amazing. It's out there. You're not alone. It doesn't mean you're choosing to have this illness. It doesn't mean you're lazy. It doesn't mean you should be ashamed. It means your brain is having difficulty getting its circuits to work right. And more importantly, the treatments that are available now are better than they've ever been, and they're only getting better. The choices we have to use now are just light years ahead of what we had 20 years ago. It's a whole different ballgame.
Love that. When it comes to lifestyle or self-care, you touched on quite a few in the book, from sleep, nutrition, but what would be a couple of self-care practices that if someone was living with depression, on top of seeing their GP and a qualified psychiatrist who is actually qualified in psychiatry medication, which I believe is very important to see a psychiatrist when it comes to medication. But on top of that, what are some other therapies you would recommend?
Well, the biggest thing, if you're going to do anything, exercise and make it fun. There's Nordic walking. I ride an exercise bike. There's people who do sort of power walking. There's people who jog. The World Health Organization sort of said about 150 to 160 minutes of moderate exercise or 75 minutes of high intensity exercise will protect your brain from dementia. It also is somewhat antidepressant. I love the story that I told in the book about the patient. I believe his name was Sam. And please keep in mind, these are composites. They're not the actual person's name or anything like that. And that is permission to tell the story. Here's a kid who's going to college. He has to take a semester off because of his depression, but he gets things back together enough to get back into school. He's a very, very bright, very successful young man right now. But at the time, he really was stuck. He finally gets a little bit better and he re-enrolls in college, but he's blocked out of the housing because it's too late. He's got to ride his bike, and he's riding his bike 5 miles each way, literally a day. And he notices a couple weeks in that he starts to feel better. And he's feeling much, much better. And then he goes home for what we call the Thanksgiving break, which is about a week. And his mood drops because he's not riding his bike. And then he goes back to school and he starts riding again. And then we figure out his meds a little bit better and he gets a better place so that when he will move closer, we can hold his mood. Now, what's interesting about him, even though he knew this, and even though during COVID, he lived in a building that had an exercise room just a few floors down, he couldn't get there on his own. We had to adjust his meds, and then finally he could get back to exercising again. But exercise can be that powerful in terms of its effect on depression. And in fact, in mild and moderate depression, it can almost be as effective as fluoxetine, or what we know as Prozac, and I'm not sure what it's called down there. It has a very good antidepressant effect, and it also is really good for your brain. So that's the number one thing that I try to do. It's not easy, but I did manage to get my 30 minutes in this morning. I would strongly encourage people that. The other thing to do is to really focus on a diet that's rich in vegetables, particularly dark green leafy vegetables, low in the sort of processed sugars and carbohydrates, because those tend to go right to the belly and they tend to increase the kind of fat that causes increased inflammation. Inflammation is not great for your brain. I mean, we've all heard about free radicals. It even made its way into a James Bond movie once about free radicals, right? You want to avoid those. They're not good for you. One of the ways you do that is by paying attention to your body weight and paying attention to your sugar intake and sticking more to whole foods, again, green leafy veggies, and lean proteins. And those proteins, if you can make it more fish and stay away from the sort of grain-fed red meats, then you probably will have a slightly better outcome. In fact, the Mediterranean diet, there's a study, they gave the Mediterranean diet to college students and found that ones who got the Mediterranean diet, 30% lower incidence of depression than the ones who didn't get it, who just got the regular diet. So a diet rich in natural foods, plants, a lot of plants, and not so much fatty proteins. The other thing that I tend to do in terms of that, I will say it drives my wife a little nuts, but she's learned to put up with me. I think the other thing that is really important is for people to pay attention to sleep. And it's hard because insomnia and oversleeping can be symptoms of depression. Part of that circuitry that gets disrupted are the centers in the brain that regulate sleep and focus and concentration. If you aren't sleeping well, that can lead to other things. You get into rhythms and routines. You turn on the TV, you get the blue light from the TV, that wakes you up more. And then you're tired when you wake up in the morning. So we all have our third cup of coffee. And I guess you guys do tea.
Coffee. We're like one big coffee drinking nation, I think.
I'm personally addicted to it, but that's a separate issue. I mean, it gets you into bad routines because people have coffee late and they can't sleep. Now, the recommendation, there's something called CBTI, which is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, is that you really try to stay away from those things, the nicotine, the caffeine, and the alcohol, for at least 4 hours before you're trying to sleep. The alcohol, in part, because it disrupts your sleep rhythms. So when we sleep at night, you go through several stages. And if you don't go through that, you don't get restorative sleep. The nicotine and the caffeine because they're stimulants. So you stay away from that. The other thing that you try to do is set the environment. You stay away from the blue light on the screens. You keep your tablets off, your computers off, all of those things where you're getting bathed in that light that's waking when you're trying to go to sleep. The other thing is make the bed a place where you either sleep or have sex. If you get into being used to lounging around in your bed, just sort of goofing around, brain gets in bed and it's like, okay, well, what can I do to play here? Rather than, oh, okay, it's time to go to sleep. And that's really the other thing that you can do. The United States Veterans Administration has a free app and things that people can go to and download. At least in the US, I think you can do it internationally. I think it's there for the veterans. They made it available to everybody. And it's based on those principles. Those are the things that I do. I try to get to bed at the same time. I try to exercise at least 150 minutes a week. And I try to stick to more of a green leafy plant-based diet. I'm working on losing a bit of weight. Got to get rid of some of the old sugar habits that have accumulated over the years. That's what I've been doing.
Wow. When it comes to alcohol, we have a massive drinking culture in Australia. We have had a shift which is happening where alcohol companies are making alcohol-free beer and it's popping up in the supermarkets. If someone was feeling really depressed, do you recommend that not having alcohol could make a difference in their mental health?
This is where we get into the variation between different people. There are some people for whom it is going to make a huge difference. There are other people for whom it's not. The other thing to keep in mind is depression's cousin is often anxiety. And so people are often self-medicating anxiety as when they're using alcohol, because basically it's a powdered lorazepam or what we call Ativan. It's a liquid version of that. If we go back to that glutamate system, counter to glutamate is something called GABA. And alcohol increases your GABA system. So you're in some ways countering that glutamate system. And if you feel anxious, it's going to allow you to relax and kick back. That all having been said, one, it's empty calories that go right to your midsection. And that's, again, increases inflammation. So that's not going to help you. Two is it disrupts your sleep architecture. So you don't go through the normal stages of sleep until that alcohol's out of your system. Yeah, people think, oh, I have a drink, I'm going to pass out. Once flew from Hawaii to Los Angeles with this guy who just had 4 very quick scotches, knocked him out, and he was cold. Now that accomplished his objective, which was to not have to deal with his anxiety about flying while we were over the Pacific. But when we got there, he wasn't feeling rested. He was just sort of hungover. And that was made worse by the fact you get dehydrated on a plane and by the fact you tried to sleep. Alcohol will put you to sleep. It just doesn't let you get restful sleep, and it doesn't get restorative sleep. so you don't feel any better than that. When I do have a beer, I actually tend to go for the non-alcoholic ones. There's two that are really actually quite good, one from Boston and one from across the pond in Europe. They're refreshing, they've got a good taste to them, and I don't feel slowed down by them, and I sleep well. I don't feel sort of hungover in the morning when I have that. I think people ought to try it and try several brands and see if you can find one you like.
That's excellent to hear. You mentioned earlier you were inspired to write the book because you had people wanting to learn more about ECT. When did you actually write this book? And how did you fit writing the book in when you are so busy with all of your responsibilities that you do?
My publisher will tell you what we started in the last millennia. The reality is we started about 2 years ago, somewhere in that range, and it was a process. I'm fortunate that the people in my life gave me the time to do it, and I'm fortunate to have great colleagues who are among that, so they allowed me to do it. I took the time to read some of this stuff after it was written and make very helpful suggestions. It's really a combination of making the time to do it and getting the support to make that time from the people in my life, both the professional side and the personal side.
I love your gratitude to everyone who supported you, and I'm so grateful that you went to all the effort to write Brain Reboot and to really share the work that you do amongst others, but also your clients, because by them allowing you to share the stories, and you shared one in this podcast, we're able to learn from them through their own journey, and it gives a lot of hope and insight. Mm-hmm. And it was just an incredible book that I would recommend definitely every GP and psychiatrist in the world, or anyone in mental health, should definitely grab a copy of Brain Reboot. Also, you can get it on Audible, and it'll be available on audio. Anyone who has a family member suffering with depression, or you might be interested just learning more about depression, or you might be living with depression, I just feel that it gives so much hope. And if we go back to your introduction, I just love "Don't give up hope." Michael Henry, what I love most is you're just providing and giving hope. And it's a beautiful message after a terrible couple of years that the whole world's had. It's triggered a lot of depression, a lot of mental illness, brain illness. Just loved your book, and thank you again for writing it.
Well, thank you for taking the time to listen to it and to read it. And I would actually point people to the afterword as well. Those are actual words from a patient about their experience with it, and they gave me permission to use it. I really appreciate people taking the time to look at it, and hopefully it's a tool for people, which is really what it was designed to be. So thank you so much.
Before we say goodbye, what is your hope for your newfound book readers or Audible audio listeners?
Hope is that they can get back to their lives, and they can get back to the people that are important in their lives, and they can go and explore what it is that they want to explore in life. Because unfortunately, depression, when it hits people, is like the old-fashioned ball and chain. If you think of Scrooge and Marley, it's the Marley dragging around those chains. That's such a great metaphor for depression, suffering and miserable. Unshackling those chains and allowing people to get back to living life fully. That's really the hope.
I love your hope, and I love how excited you are with the new treatments for healing depression. And thank you again, Michael Henry, for all the incredible work that you've done over many, many decades helping individuals. And you mentioned something so important at the start. These are people that you're treating, and you got to get to the bottom of literally the symptoms, but them as a person, and find out what's going on in their own personal life. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned every person you see is so different. And I think that reminds me that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this.
Oh, absolutely true. Again, people start their lives with different aspirations and different temperaments and things that they want to do and their family wants them to do. And then this disease sort of derails people. It shuts people off. And in the worst case scenario, it just sticks them and warehouses them somewhere. And getting people out of that place and back into life, back into building the life they want, is really what not only I, but a whole lot of psychiatrists and a whole lot of mental health workers and clinicians are trying to do. And again, I'm really grateful that people ask me to join in their struggle and try to help them, and that they trust me to take a shot when other people have not had success. That's a great responsibility, and it's also a tremendous compliment. A privilege, really. And I can't stress the word privilege enough, to work with people and to try to help them get back on track.
I've had this vision or belief, and it's probably futuristic, and I may see it in my time, I may not. I thought a rebranding of, say, in Australia, we have what's called mental wards. I thought rebranding it to brain ward, where an individual one day could say, I'm in hospital, I'm at the brain ward. They ring up their boss and say, hey, I'm not well, I'm sick, I have a brain disease or brain illness. And when we focus then on the organ being the brain versus, oh, I just can't think happy today, that this could, one, break stigma, but two, more of a focus on the brain and circuitry and everything you've mentioned.
Take it one step further. I mean, imagine where you don't need those wards. Imagine that you can figure it out very quickly, or you can even, based on genetics or other things, anticipate that that's going to happen. And you can help people's brains go on a different trajectory so they develop the circuitry they need to never have those feelings and never have that experience. And they are able to live. That, I think, is the ultimate. And I hope that that's in the near future. Because again, we want people to not get derailed. We want people to do what it is they want to do, whether it's programming a computer, whether it's working as a lifeguard for a living, whether it's being a farmer, whether it's being a monk somewhere, whatever it is that people want to do. We want them to have the freedom and never have to deal with being derailed like that. That's what I really hope for. Don't know how utopian and optimistic that is, because I see a lot of amazing things happening.
I love your hope. That just takes it to the next level. Michael Henry, thank you again for being a guest.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening in to Feel Good From Within with Yvette Lee Blowitz, Spirit Girl podcast. I hope you found this conversation of interest and benefit to you. In support, I would love for you to subscribe to Feel Good From Within with Yvette Lee Blowitz, Spirit Girl podcast on any podcast app you listen to the show through, or on YouTube or Rumble too. And to also leave a 5-star rating and a review of what you think too. Be sure to share this show with your family, friends, and community, and to subscribe to my mailing list at spiritgirl.com, YvetteLeeBlowitz.com, and feelgoodfromwithin.com, and to follow Spirit Girl or Yvette Lee Blowitz on any social media app. And together, let's feel good from within.